Thank you, JD. Welcome, everyone. Thanks to Nysmith and Washington Exec for putting on this great event. I feel honored to be recognized. You know, I think the work that I do is in support of the interest, inspiration, passion, and success of our students. And I'm not just talking about the students at TJ, I'm talking about the students from all over. In fact, later this afternoon, if you have questions about TJ or just interest in our extension programs and how we help out the whole region, I'll have another session in here at 2:15. But I really wanted to talk, since this symposium is geared towards parents and getting involved in STEM education, I really wanted to have a conversation about parenting styles and how that relates to STEM education. So the inspiration for this talk actually came from my child's bedroom walls, which there's a picture of what is on my son Luke's walls, because he is about 1 year old. And in our media, we've heard a lot about connections to parenting styles and different animals. So next slide. Here's a picture of my son, Luke. So that was on Valentine's Day. And he just had his first birthday very recently. Next slide. And there he is, all excited. Again, with this animal theme. Now, I have to say, for those of you who may recall your child's first birthday, you probably may have had certain experiences. And I had this glorified perception about what the first birthday should be like. I thought it's like you put the cake in front of your kid, and your child just goes crazy, right? Like their first experience with sugar, and they just have so much joy. They stick their head in the cake, and they go crazy, right? And they have lots of fun because they enjoy cake. That didn't happen. We tried to feed him that cake, and he turned his head. So I thought, all right, maybe it's too fancy. You know, there's a big line in the front, and he was getting a little too much special treatment with his peers at daycare. So we went home, and we said, all right, let's try a different cake. We're just going to get a plain, we'll go to the local grocery store, just a slice of cake, and we'll give it a try. Did the same thing. So here's where I start thinking about my parenting style. So I was like, okay, what do I do? Because I just see all these great videos on YouTube about children loving their first birthday cake. And here's my kid who didn't want to even try it. So what do? We figured out, well, he likes Cheerios, so we put Cheerios on the cake. And we thought, maybe he'll be enticed, right? So sure enough, it worked. So he started picking off the Cheerios one at a time. And then he started realizing, oh my gosh, not only my hands, my face, I'm just covered in frosting. So here's how it turned out. Next slide. So I didn't have that great YouTube experience to show off, but I certainly have some good material later on when he's in high school. All right, next slide. All right, so I'm going to talk, my focus over the next 15 minutes is on parenting styles. And initially I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that's been developed around that, and then also some perceptions that teachers may have and also that I would have ultimately on linking ways to get your kids involved in STEM. So Baumrind really started this all in 1967, started looking at early childhood experiences in cognitive and social competence. And then later, 50 years later, we hear about tiger parenting and all different other types of animals and parenting. So next slide. I'm going to review some of those. So Baumrind used the language authoritarian. However, the language now is used as a tiger parent. And you can read what's on the slide to get a sense of what a tiger parent might be like. Next slide. And then the dolphin parent, Baumrind used the term authoritative, which is a different style, having the children having specific rights and a particular voice in the choices that they have. And then in the next slide is the jellyfish parent, which is more of a permissive nature, fewer rules, self-regulation, doesn't really want punishment, doesn't think it's a good thing to do. My parents, definitely jellyfish parents, without a doubt. And I believe it happened as a matter of circumstance. So the only rule for me was just make sure the police don't call us in the middle of the night. I was a third on a string of all brothers, all boys. My mother, God bless her soul, put up with all of us. And by the time my turn came up, they definitely had a jellyfish parenting style. So the notion of parenting styles I recognize as being mixed. You know, you could say, hey, sometime for this kid we need to be more like a jellyfish. For this kid we need to be more like a tiger. I realize that could totally depend on who the child is and also the nature of the circumstance. So to say that we're a specific type of parent might be a little too restrictive. However, you can take a test. There are plenty of them online. Next slide. So, you know, there's one that I picked off of Psychology Today. It's free. You know, you just go online, you fill out the form. And what might be interesting for you, in case you're curious, is, you know, you could reflect on what you think your own parenting style is and then have your child do that and see if there's any similarities. Just by, it doesn't hurt to ask, right? So just by show of hands, you know, in general, I'm going to ask you, which of these parenting styles do you think you are? Or do you think you're more like a tiger? Do you think you're more like a dolphin? Or do you think you're more like a jellyfish? So go ahead. Personal reflection. Raise your hand if you think you're more like a tiger. Okay? There's no, by the way, there's no, I'll let you know in advance, there's really no right or wrong answer. Okay, next, raise your hand if you think you're more like a dolphin. Okay, and then raise your hand if you think you're more like a jellyfish. Okay, so it's good that we have representation across the room. And you may actually think that you are a different style as well. So there's all sorts of animals associated with parenting styles. Next slide. So you've got the kangaroo parent. Okay, there's another one. Keep going. The lion parent. Okay. And then the next one, the panda parent. And I'm sure there's many, many more, okay? But most of the research has actually been surrounding the authoritarian, the authoritative, and the permissive. Now, there is another style of parenting that I did not include, which is found in the research, which is associated with a dismissive parenting style. But, you know, for obvious reasons, I'm not going to really reflect on that one. Okay, next slide. Okay, so I want to give you, this is my own anecdotal perceptions of what I sense from parents, from teachers when they're interacting with parents. And really what I want to convey is there isn't a best approach. And I'll share the research with you in a little bit about what that tells us about student performance and interest in STEM. But I think that there's pros and cons in every single style. So, you know, my parents were a jellyfish, so they just said, go do whatever you like to do. I mean, when I grew up, it was like, go out and play. And you just went out, and I showed up at 5 p.m. for dinner, and that was it. There wasn't a lot of structure. There wasn't expectations. It was just go do what you enjoy doing. Okay? So I think in each style there's pros and cons. And the most important part of this slide, in my opinion, is just to recognize, hey, what are some of those pros and cons, and then how do I reconcile that at home when I'm interacting with school? Okay, next slide. Okay, so now I'm going to start talking about the research. So this research, you know, in the early 70s by Baumrind and her staff, showed for young children, here are some associations with cognitive and social competence. Based on her research, which is really the foundation work, that authoritative style tended to result in higher cognitive competence and social competence. That prompted researchers later to look at what happens as kids get older. So let's go to the next slide. So now a group of colleagues out at Stanford looked at what happens when students start reaching high school. And this is one study. It was done out in the West Coast. I'm not going to say that these are empirical all over. It was a result of one study. So what they found out was consistent from early childhood that students have higher achievement. Higher achievement is associated with what students perceive their grades were. They also noticed that heritage had some influence in some of the outcomes. So they noticed that in Asian heritage families, there wasn't any distinction in the outcome of achievement based on parenting style, whereas in Hispanic families, it was completely different. And if you're interested in any of these articles, you're welcome to get in touch with me. I'm happy to send you the PowerPoint slides, which list all the references. Okay, now you may wonder what happens in college. So that's the next slide. So in this study by Hickman, it looked at what happens to kids when they go to college. How do they cope? How do they survive? How well will they do? It turns out that students' sense of self-esteem is the most important factor. Is that influenced by parenting style? It might. It may not. What I found interesting is it said children from divorced families seem to adjust well, which was originally a surprise to their finding, because students from broken homes tend to have more difficulty academically, according to the research. However, the researchers hypothesized that students have to develop a sense of resiliency by facing difficult circumstances when they're growing up, and if they're in a separated household or have difficult circumstances economically, that they actually can adjust to college quite well because they've developed that sense of transition. Okay, next slide. Okay, so then Reeves, in a recent article out of the Brookings Institute, they examined how does parenting style influence achievement. This is parenting style versus all the other factors. So parenting style is one component. And their conclusion was, well, it helps a little, but in the end, you have situations that happen outside of school, outside of the home, non-environmental factors, non-home environmental factors such as what happens in school, the friends, the decisions they make, and as well as genetics, who you are, your own disposition. So they concluded that about 1/3 of who your child becomes is influenced by the style that you have as a parent. They did notice that the most significant impact in a negative way is associated with economic well-being, as well as the parents' education. So families that families that have parents who have not graduated high school are at an extreme disadvantage based on the findings from their research. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so does it matter if your style is authoritarian, authoritative, or permissive? Based on the research, it would say it influences 1/3 of your child's development. So then, if most of the influence occurs outside of the approaches that you take as a parent, it's about you setting up the stage. How can you facilitate an environment to encourage students to pursue different career choices or get interested in certain subjects? Okay, so there's two different articles. One is an expert opinion from the National Association of the Gifted, and the other is from research that I've listed up here. So there are activities that you could do at home as simple as just reading to your child about stories related to STEM. Accessing materials off of the internet that can help you do activities at home to get students interested in taking kids to a museum, science museum. From a research perspective, the huge influence is actually how you respond. And I found this as being really important, what's in the lower right-hand corner. It's ultimately on how you react at home when your child has a particular curiosity or an interest or an assignment. You set the stage as parents. So if they say, if your child says, I've got 30 math problems, and you respond, math is worthless, that won't help them it won't help them get excited about that subject area. It's about helping them build that resiliency. If a student expressed interest in a particular project, you showing interest in responding to their own curiosity plays a huge role in propelling their interest. The research says if a student shows interest in something, it's likely their parents are going to be responsive to that. So if they don't show interest in STEM, then I'll talk about that aspect next. But there's so much about your attitude and your disposition and how you respond to your child when they're coping with a situation, whether it be curiosity or a struggle. And the more you do that in a positive manner, the more likely they're going to find interest to that. Next slide. Okay, so Wang and DeGaulle did a wonderful job with a literature review on all the research on influences in STEM careers. Some of it is associated with parenting. Most of it is associated outside of parenting. So those are 4 primary factors. Their development of efficacy. Hey, I can do really well in math and science. If they start believing in themselves, they're more likely going to pursue it. So my recommendation for parents is ensure that they're in classes that they can do really well. One of the pitfalls, particularly in Northern Virginia, is to try and get students on a fast track to take the most advanced courses. And my recommendation is if your student isn't doing well in the advanced courses, there's no reason to be in those advanced courses. It's much better, in my opinion, for students to have success in a level of in the course that they're in compared to being in the more advanced course. Second, influence by mentors is huge. So get a good handle on if your child has a teacher who inspires him or her about these STEM fields. Tell me which classes you love. And if they respond in other areas, then if your interest is to expose them more to STEM, find some mentors. You can find mentors through enrichment programs. There's many, many people here today who can give you a good idea of where there are resources outside of a school that can get students really excited. It's often having someone who's excited about what they do and getting the young ones excited that have such a huge factor. At the high school level, it's working directly with a professional. Makes a huge difference. Okay, next item is stereotypes lead to limitations. So this is a negative effect. So the research says, essentially, that there are stereotypes that dissuade interest in STEM. For example, the research says that parents have a tendency to tell females that they do well in school as a result of working hard, and males that they do well in school as a result of their ability. Try to avoid that. Try to recognize what students are good at and why they're really good at that. The research says that girls are dissuaded from computer science and hard sciences. Try to find role models to prove otherwise. There are great female computer scientists. There are great female physicists. Our children really need to understand that there are fantastic role models associated with their own sex. It's very, very, very important. Otherwise, us as parents can fulfill, a negative impression on dissuading students in going a certain direction. The research also says that a huge influence on career choice occurs in the middle and high school years. So look for all those enrichment options, but the research also says if you try and force it upon students, then they may actually turn the other way, and they may become resentful that they have to be involved in something. So instead of saying, hey, you really need to go to this program, instead try to say, here are 5 or 6 different options available to you. Which of these look interesting? Give the students some choice so that they feel like they're not being forced into it, and they'll have some opportunities. In my opinion, that is the best article I've read associated with nurturing kids into STEM careers. Next slide. Okay, so this is my last slide. So a couple of economists from the University of Chicago wrote a book called Freakonomics about 10 years ago. And there's just individual chapters to pique your curiosity on things that might be counterintuitive. And one of their chapters is what makes a perfect parent. So it's not really what makes a perfect parent. The chapter is really about where in the research about student performance is there some associations with habits of parents. But, you know, they give you that title to kind of make you want to read the chapter, which I did. In fact, I read the whole book. It's a neat book. So what they did is they looked at some data associated with some of those factors and many more. You know, you ask yourself as a parent, hey, do we need to stay, does one of us need to stay home for the first 5 years while the child is being raised? Do we need to have a big library? Do we need to take our kid to museums? Does our education matter? Does it matter if we're involved in the parent-teacher organization at school? Does it matter how many hours of television our child is watching? Okay, so they looked at all sorts of comparative data. It's really correlational, so it's not causation. There's no cause and effect here, but they looked at correlational data. And it turns out that some of these have some strong correlations, and I won't go through that. But they did have a general summary after looking at all of these different metrics. And they said, you know what, by the time you become parents, what you do with your kids actually doesn't matter nearly as much as who you are. It's the values that you have at home, the appreciation you show towards things, the way in which you treat other people, the way in which your curiosity is piqued, and how you respond to other people's curiosity, particularly kids. It's those values that you demonstrate at home that ultimately have the highest impact on student engagement at home. Some of these things, yes, they're important, which you can read about, but ultimately it's who you are that makes the most important factor. Regardless if you're a tiger, a dolphin, or a jellyfish, it's all about being a good role model for your kids. Thank you very much.